record on this computer. Welcome back to the Context Coaching Podcast. Today we're joined by Dan Rigby, founder of Win the Day Journal, former head coach, wrestling that is, at Caesar Rodney High School in Delaware. Coach, appreciate having you on.
Justin, man, glad to be here. Excited to talk some coaching game.
Well, let's do that. And to get started, if you could help me ground the audience in your background and where you're from, what your journey was like, how did you get here? Take us through your background as an athlete and a coach. What does that path look like throughout the various titles you've held over the years?
Yeah, man. So I was a good wrestler in Delaware. You know, Delaware's not a huge state, but wrestling's pretty tough here. We're in like a hotbed of wrestling in the country, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, some of those really tough wrestling states. So I was a good wrestler. I wouldn't say I was a great wrestler. I was a better leader than I was actual wrestler. I took a really bad loss my senior year in the state finals, and it kind of changed the path for me. I decided that I wasn't going to go to college to wrestle. But I immediately went to college and started coaching right away. 18 years old, I was coaching other 17-year-olds down the road from my college, and I fell in love with it, to be honest with you. And once I started coaching, I knew that I wanted to kind of stay in that career field, and that was a passion of mine. Got a job right out of college as a teacher. I was an assistant coach for one more year, and then I got hired as a head wrestling coach at a pretty darn successful program at the ripe age of 22. I took over for a guy who was, for all intents and purposes, kind of a legend in our area, who kind of went out on some bad terms. So I had some big shoes to fill. Coached there for 5 years, and then I went out. I went back to my alma mater, which was like the perennial powerhouse in wrestling in Delaware, for the best coach to ever coach in Delaware, who also went out on bad terms. So I had to step into two big sets of shoes in some not great circumstances, and I learned a lot about myself, about my coaching philosophy, about kids, about the process, and it was enjoyable. I stepped away 2 years ago, but I still work with teams of all different sports, kind of all over the country now. So still in it, but just not in the direct coaching role.
Yeah. Okay. So I got a couple follow-up questions here.
Sure.
One, I'm just going to make a note, and you can clarify this if you want, or you could ignore it. It seems like, in my experience with wrestling, and we're in a small area, similarly, California's huge, obviously, but where we live on the Central Coast is much smaller. But it seems like, because wrestling is this smaller niche sport, and I mean, it's huge in regards to the impact it has, right? It's an Olympic sport, etc., but small enough to where you're mentioning these kind of legends in the area. It seems like everybody knows everybody in the sport, and all of those type guys run USA Wrestling as well. Do I have that right?
You're 100% right. I'm going to a conference in Florida next month, and there'll be 400 coaches there, and you'll probably know 100 of them by name, just by virtue of being at a tournament with them, training with them, at a camp, whatever it may be, connecting with them. And that's the cool thing about it. It's so small that you can reach out to the top coach in the country, and they're going to get back to you with some feedback. I don't know that you have that luxury in a lot of other sports, to be honest with you.
No, you don't. And the other thing I would say, and it seems to play into what you're doing right now, where even our retirees, whatever age they are at, don't ever fully stop being involved in the sport, because the luxury to do that doesn't exist. They need you to stay involved. So our section commissioner was a long-time wrestling coach, and then he moved from the high school level to the section level, and he was still refereeing and running these tournaments, because if he doesn't do it, the sport does.
Yeah, that's a great point. I also think, like, and this is not to step up on any other sports or anything like that, wrestling is such an intimate, interwoven type of somebody's life. Like, I know you're a basketball guy and football guys and baseball guys and softball and soccer. Those things and wrestling is different, because it's like, it's really hard not to formulate your identity within that sport. Whereas in other sports, you can step away and be like, I can go watch a baseball game and just kind of be casual. Wrestling's not like that. It's like literally who you are. It's part of who you are. That can be a dangerous thing. But it's different. It's kind of like gymnastics. It's kind of the same boat. Like swimming's kind of the same way, where it's because it's a lot of individual based things. So yeah, it is. It keeps people in it for a lot longer. And you're right. If we don't keep those people in it, then the sport dies. And that's the never ending journey for wrestling, is how do we grow the sport when these pioneers have kind of ridden off into the sunset.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, because it's what I've noticed, and I'm not a wrestler. My son did it for a little bit, and then life got in the way.
Yeah.
But I've always, and I think I wrestled in sixth grade and was like, yeah, this ain't my thing, man. But I would say this: I've always respected it, as I think it's probably one of the toughest things you could ever do. It is like the definition of hard,
Yeah.
and it's something I think everybody should try once, but not necessarily something that everyone's going to fall in love with. So from that, I want to pivot to something you said about you took a tough loss in your senior year, and that essentially ended your career. And you said it differently, obviously, but it reminded me of what Rory McIlroy just said in an
Oh,
interview last night, which was the loss he took this weekend was so crushing that he needs 3 or 4 weeks to like reset and get right about it. So talk
yeah.
about your own journey and how that moment was that transformational for you, that you were like, yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, yeah. No, I love that you said that about Rory too, because I saw that and I was waiting to drop that in one of my calls today. So you did that for me and I appreciate it. To be honest with you, I think maybe the way I described it wasn't as indicative of the path that I was on. I was borderline whether I was going to go to college or not. It wasn't like, man, Dan, you lost and all of a sudden you changed your whole trajectory. I was borderline, but I will tell you this, it was crushing, and it was crushing to me for a couple of reasons. Number one, I come from like a wrestling family where all my uncles were state champions and all Americans and all this different stuff, my brothers and cousins. And so for me to have an upset loss in the finals, my parents already had a party planned, like family was in town to watch. It was like it was an all around bad experience. I was winning. I had beaten the kid badly prior. It was like when you get upset, the entire gym erupts. So I'm like, everybody hates me. So it was one of those things. But it was funny because my uncle, who was one of the only ones that did not win a state championship, lost in a very similar method. I was at his house, and he's a hard dude, man. And he was like, Dan, you got to get back on the horse. I'm like, Uncle Harry, man, I'm done. He's like, nope, you got a senior wrestling match. You can't go out like that. You got the senior all-star match. You got to do that. And I wasn't going to do that. I was like, nope, I'm done. I'm going to be a sissy about it. I'm just burnt out. I'm done. Hanging up my shoes. And he's like, you'll never forgive yourself if you don't go give it one more shot and go out on top. So I did. And I had an awful performance in this match. I mean, an awful performance in this match. And I actually ended up getting beat by this New Jersey kid, who was just like better than me anyway. But he was right, man. I had to go out knowing that I kind of gave it my all, and like not on those terms. I was okay losing to someone who was just better than me. I wasn't okay losing the way that I went. So, but you know what? That whole experience shaped my entire philosophy and everything I did coaching wise from that point on. And I think honestly, if I didn't take that loss, I wouldn't be as passionate and as motivated about coaching as I am today.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm having flashbacks to college right now, where my roommates were wrestlers from a small town in California in the Central Valley. And what you just described, it's like this family kind of dynamic where everybody did it. This is the expectation you have, and like what that burden feels like, both on the positive and the negative. And it was just, I lived through that with these guys in college who had these stellar high school careers. And it was like, do I want to keep doing it? Right. To your point of being burned out or not, just a tough deal. And it's like so validating and fulfilling. But then when you hit that tipping point, how do you translate that energy into something positive, which sounds like you did? So let's get into that. How did it inform your coaching philosophy? What are the things that you took away from that journey, and how did those define your coaching approach?
Yeah, I think for me, I was my biggest worst. I was my own worst enemy, man. I knew what I was capable of. I knew what I could do, but I was the ultimate king of like psyching myself out. You know, I was so concerned about what if I lose? What if I lose? What if I lose? Dan, just don't do this. And every time you say all you need to do to win this match is just don't get pinned. And what happens every time you do that? You get pinned. And so, it's fourth quarter, we're marching down the field. Just all you need to do is not throwing an interception. And what happens? You throw an interception. And so like, I didn't want anybody to go through that. And so I got really, really big into the sports psych side of things. My coach was really good at that, man. But I didn't always hear what he was saying to me, and I kind of needed to be a little bit better for myself. So one of my big passions in coaching was coaching with that in mind of like how to beyond the X and O's. What else can we do beyond the X and O's to prepare our athletes mentally and emotionally for tough situations, right? And not just tough situations like in a tough match or in a tough game or in a tough environment. Like what happens when tough things happen, and then like how do you respond to them like for life? And so that was a big thing for me. And I kind of to be honest, I think part of it for me was I even though I wrestled that last match, I still didn't ever really feel settled about the way I went out, and I needed to do something about it. And so for the next 15 years or 18 years, I did, and it really formed kind of the way I coached.
And from that, you mentioned earlier that you had to follow up two challenging situations where you're taking over for people that had tremendous success, and there's a huge track record of legacy at these places. And without getting in the weeds on what happened, talk about what it was like to follow in those shoes at both jobs and what you learned the first time, and then the second time, how you're able to navigate that based on your first experience doing that.
Yeah, that was huge, man. I 22 years old. You think you know everything. You think you're invincible, and you just don't know jack diddly. Like you just don't know anything, man. And it didn't help matters that my uncle was also a legendary coach at this school, had won 2 state titles, had like half of his team were individual state champions. So I kind of got the job because of that. I mean, I won't admit that to anybody in Delaware, but that's true. And so this guy had a program that was like they were good. I didn't like the way the program was being run, and I tell him that to this day, that I needed to change the culture. I just didn't know how to really change the culture. I knew what I thought I needed to do, but man, I ripped that joker down and I built it back up. It just wasn't like this smooth process of like tearing it down and then an upward climb. It was like a roller coaster. We'd go up, we'd go back, we'd go up, we'd go back. And there were times I didn't trust myself, man. I didn't trust what I was doing. I didn't trust the process, but I knew I had to continue this. I like, you did this. Now you need to see it through. And it's funny though, because by the time I left my last 2 years, we were back-to-back state champs. We were like 29-1 over my last 2 years, which got me this new job. And so when I got this new job, which was a bigger division school, I had this self-confidence that I knew what I could do because I did it there, right? Like when we talk about athletes and self-efficacy, it's like, you've done this before, so you know what to do. Now you just got to implement it. And it was just a different set of challenges, but I knew how to build culture and I knew how to build programs like big picture. So it was an easier transition for me the second time through, because I had already kind of formulated my coaching identity that I didn't have my first and second year when I was like I was a god awful coach. Like I look back and I see those guys now and I say, I'm sorry that I was I wasn't the coach that you needed to be. And they're so great about it. They're like, Rigby, man, you didn't know. I'm like, I know I didn't know, but I'm just sorry. So that second job was a lot easier transition for me because I knew who I was, I knew what I stood for, and I knew where I wanted to go. And I just needed people to get on the bus and follow me, and they did, and we ended up winning a fair amount there too.
So let's talk about that, right? Culture is this buzzword in coaching and community, and ultimately it doesn't mean a whole lot, right? It means a ton for those that understand what culture means at their place. And what does that mean, right? I knew how to build culture. I knew how to build it or take it down and build it back up. How do you go about that, right? What's the blueprint?
Yeah, so it's funny. You're right. Culture is one of those words that all the coaches like to throw around, and it sounds cool, and they're like, "Come be part of a winning culture." But what does that really? It's like people say grit. People say, "Oh," it's like they don't know what any of those words mean. I make it as simple as possible, man. I'm like pull a little Nick Saban here. I say how you do something is how you do everything, right? Like, I would watch how my athletes did every single thing, right? I'd watch them walking to practice. I'd watch them walking from the locker room into the wrestling room. I'd watch if they had their shoes tied or they were tying them when they were on the mat. I'd watch how when I was taught, every single thing that we did was noted. And it got to the point, and it's appropriate, but it's younger folks won't understand it. There was a show, and I think it's still out, called Cheaters, where they would hire a private investigator to go around and basically catch a significant other cheating on somebody. And this guy Joey Gecko would film them, and we would do that in wrestling practice, right? I would say, hey, coach, go over there and film. And kids would say, oh, I'm practicing really hard. I'm really hard. I said, now Joey Gecko over there says otherwise, man. Go watch the film. And when they see the data, right, then they start saying, all right, well, that's not part of a championship culture. That's not going to get me to where I want to be. So, and again, that's a very broad answer, you know what I mean? But like, I think it's a broad response. It's how our entire program does everything. It comes down to as simple as this: how are our fans cheering at matches? Are our fans cheering against referees? Because that's not part of our culture. We don't do that. How do we clean up the bleachers after a match? Do we leave it for the custodians, or do we get in the bleachers and get our hands dirty? You know, when it's 2:45 and practice starts, when somebody walks through that door at 2:46, it's like, oh my goodness, who did that? It's everything we do. And from our warm-ups to our nutrition, our kids were very strict diets before matches. Like, what do we eat pregame? Very important. Like, we're minimal protein, high carb. Hour before we work it off, refuel again. So it was literally how we did everything. And I think coaches that really want to build culture, it can't just be a Monday where they motivate. It can't just be a grind and a lion out there. It's got to be all the way across the board, how your program does everything, how your coaches talk to athletes, everything. So I could go on and on and on about that, but I think really it's all in those little details. That's how you build winning culture.
Well, for those people that couldn't follow, it's the cliche of, right, what you measure, you can get better at. And what are your non-negotiables and how are you doing that? So it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly what you said, but it is very much what are the hills you're dying on and how do you hold people accountable to those through data, right? Or film. And what you permit, you promote. So how do you take away those things that you are not trying to allow? Fascinating. Okay, so in that space, right, as a wrestler, it's a very specific discipline. What have you noticed that translates both as a coach from wrestling to other disciplines and that you have observed in other disciplines that you've been able to implement as a wrestling coach and or athlete?
Yeah. So I think a lot of teams, a lot of coaches enjoy having wrestlers on their team because the sport itself requires a certain amount of discipline to be successful. Like, you can be talented, but if you're not disciplined, you're never going to really reach that full potential. Just much like every other sport, but there's all these pieces of discipline, like weight management, like your warm-up policies, like how do you do a lot of things. So it's also really tough because you're 1v1. There's no hiding. Like, it's on full display. If you're a guard and you're getting owned on the line of scrimmage, the 1,000 people in the bleachers might not know that. They might not know that you're slacking in practice. It's on full display for everybody at a wrestling match if you're working hard or you're getting worked right there. So, like, that's important. And for me, one of the things that I was really big on, I'm just an observer. Like, I'm just an observing nerd. Like, I want to go watch. I watch everybody's practice everywhere, and I can go to teams and say, that team's got something going on. There's something special here. I loved watching our basketball team warm up, man, because as soon as that whistle blew, it was light switch. It was go. It was high energy. It was fast paced. And I really love that. I love fast paced practices. I think sometimes we do disservice with kids in 2024 and 2023 trying to slow down and teach the really, really fundamentally. And I'm like, man, like, if I can teach this in 2 minutes compared to 10 minutes and still get 80% effectiveness rather than 85, why wouldn't I do that? So I loved watching other coaches and what they did well. I love watching body language. Body language was a huge thing for me. And I keep reverting back to basketball, but I would frequently have my teams go in and say, let's watch the ebb and flow of the game. And you tell me who's going to win based on somebody's body language, because body language tells a story. And then it was a cool thing because not only did they start to say, oh yeah, body language, but they also started to recognize it that you can start picking up on these things in your matches, right? When that guy is kind of hanging out on the out of bounds line and you beat them back to the middle, how do you you're breaking their spirit as we speak. And when you see that blood in the water, you got to go get it. And so I always took a lot of pride in our teams. We're just more mentally tough, better conditioned than everybody else. And when we saw blood in the water, we went and got it. And so I think a lot of that was from watching other sports in our school, not like hoping that they didn't do well, but the teams that they were playing and things like that.
All right, I want to ask about what you just said in regards to being better conditioned and having a fast-paced practice, right? And if you can get something done in 2 minutes versus however many, why wouldn't you do that? Number one question, why do you think there's such a hurdle or block that coaches have to being efficient? Do you think it's because they don't realize they're inefficient? Do you think it's because this is how I've always done things? Are we not creative enough? I would love your thoughts on that. And then the second piece is, how have you figured out how to hack conditioning so that it is not the approach of old, right? Get on the baseline and run, or we're going to do relay runs around the wrestling room, whatever it might be. Just talk a little bit about those concepts.
Yeah. So the first point, I think you hit them all, right? I think coaches who don't run efficient practices, it's probably a plethora of reasons. Number one, they don't know how. If they don't know how. Number two, they haven't bought into the idea that planning a practice should be just like planning a class. And if your practices are not scheduled out appropriately, then that's a problem. And I think number three, to be honest with you, I think sometimes coaches lack the energy. When you have a high pace practice, you got to have a high gas tank. Your gas tank's got to be full, and you got to be ready to rock. Because I noticed this: the culture of my room took on the culture of me. What I mean by that is, if I walked into the room and my energy level was low, my practices stunk. If I was ripping and roaring and hooting and hollering, my athletes just went. So I think it's all three, and a lot of it is this is the way we've always done things. And I think, and this might be a little bit of, people might get a little bit offended by this, but I think sometimes, the coaches will say things like, well, we're going to do this. We're going to take the time and do this right. And I get that. Like, I'm into hardcore technique and like really good sound fundamental things, but I'm also into how kids learn right now and how kids need to go. And so when I would have a really fast paced practice, there was no sitting around. There was no getting off task. It was conditioning, because we'd get to the middle and we'd get right. I wouldn't even get to the middle. I'd say, stop and sit. Just sit where you are. Because if I bring you to the middle and then send you back out, that transition time, I'm losing a minute every time. I need that minute, And so stop and sit, teach, go, and I can fix it. So I think there's a lot of that. It's all the above. In terms of hacking, it's like biohacking, right? It's like, how do I hack this plan to get the most efficient model for my athletes? Like, I'm like, boxers need to run. Like, there's no doubt about it. MMA guys need to run because they can't keep beating up their bodies all the time. But the best way to get into boxing shape is to box or to spar. The best way to get into MMA shape is to spar. The best way to get into wrestling shape is wrestling-based activities. And so I was always like, even in our warm-ups would be a lot of teams I watch, and they just jog, and it's like, then they stand and stretch. And I'm like, get that crap out of here. Let's tumble. Let's become better athletes. Let's go through a slow based drill where we're focusing on technique to prepare our bodies for the movements that we're actually going to do, like a dynamic warm up with wrestling based things. And the same thing with conditioning, man. I liked making my kids into monsters. I'm glad I'm out of the game now, because I could probably get fired for some of this. But like, I liked when it was 10 minutes before practice and the kids knew it. And it's like, this is where I'm gonna break my partner. And if they have to go through that door, they go through that door, but they're not coming back in here. Like, I'm throwing them through the door when we're wrestling, and they're, or I'm ripping their shirt off, like whatever. It's all these little mind tricks that we played, but they started embracing that kind of crazy attitude. And then, did we run? Sure, we ran, but like, and is there like a time where you put kids on the line and you say, let's do the pacer test to kind of build a different sense of mental toughness? Sure, but like, most of our stuff was done through wrestling, because I was getting better at wrestling, I was getting mentally tough, and I was getting conditioned. Why would I just waste my time on just strictly running, or just, and to be honest with you, you can get just as injured doing some of that stuff as you can wrestling. So let's try to. I always try to check as many boxes as possible in my practices, and I think we did a pretty good job of that.
Yeah, and I would ask a follow-up then for people who don't necessarily know how to run an efficient practice or to hack some of these things. Like, what are some tools that you can offer up, some specific takeaways, both in wrestling and other things you've seen in other sports, where it's like, hey, you're historically doing X. Have you thought about Y? Right? Do you have a couple of things that are just like, hey, look, this would transform your efficiency from 20% to 80 just by doing this?
Yeah, yeah. No, I don't have a recipe and I don't have a magic pill, but I can tell you this, man. When I first started coaching, and YouTube was kind of around. I don't know if it was around, but like I learned so much just watching YouTube, and I learned so much just watching other people. Like, why would I not model my practices after all the best people? I think, and again, I'm not being rude, but I think people who are hungry for the material can go out and find it, right? Like you can go to camps now and now you can see them on webinars and go to trainings. Like I learned so much just from asking questions. We would go to Penn State. Penn State's won 11 of the last 13 national championships. And we'd go to their camp and I would just sit and write. Like I was never too egotistical to ask the high school guy next to me what he did or what she did. And like, you know what? When Cale Sanderson, who's the most legendary guy, when I saw him by himself, I'm going to ask him the questions that I have to ask him. And if he says no, I'm going to find him again later and I'm going to get those questions answered. I think like older, more or just successful coaches are always so willing to mentor and build and help. And all you have to do is ask. And if they say no, who cares? Find somebody else because there are people out there who do so much better stuff than I ever did. All I did was rob them. I just stole their stuff and brought it into my program. And now all of a sudden my program's better. And who looks like the genius? Me. People think I was this really good. I wasn't. I just was really good at gathering material from other people. And I think, if you're a basketball coach in California, you can probably think of 10 people right now that you could go to and say, hey, you run this zone like a little bit differently than we, how do we, they're going to answer it. And I just think in 2024, it's, I don't want to say it's lazy not to, but it it's irresponsible not to because we have so much technology that we can use all the time. And it just takes a little bit of work and it takes a little bit of that, like, you got to put your ego to the side and say, my kids are going to benefit from this if I do this. So I need to say, hey, I'm going to swallow my pride and go ask that guy who we beat the last 3 years, mind you, because I like the way that they do this. And I think that's really the recipe.
No, and I think you're right. I think the access that technology has given us today in regards to even setting up conversations. I mean, I had a call the other day with a guy that is one of the directors for a basketball academy in New South Wales, Australia. Right. And it was like, why not? Zoom exists for a reason.
Yeah.
Why are we not using it? Right. And so I think ultimately, to your point, irresponsible if you are tasked with leading and keeping people safe, but also I think, and I think you're right. It's not lazy. It's do you know that these resources are out there and how are you
Yeah.
utilizing them rather than hoping things land in your lap, right? And so I
Yep.
think that's even the impetus of what we're doing right now on the pod. It's like, how can we take information and offer it up to the masses? So win the day planner. Talk a little bit about the evolution of that, how you actually implement it into your, let's call it school-based coaching, how
Yeah.
people would utilize it, what value add you have seen, and just a little bit about why that's your new passion.
Yeah. So, I mean, you probably heard me when we were talking about culture, how you do some things, how you do everything. For me, um, this planner is that. How do we wake up in the morning? Are we keeping track of our sleep? Are we keeping track of our social media time? Are we tracking our meals? Are we writing down goals for practice today? Are we reflecting on what we did well? All these soft skills that are really important um, are all elements of our planner. And for me, what happened was I was working with a group of athletes on some leadership and some culture stuff, and what I recognized is they could tell me everything that was right. We were doing John Gordon books and we were doing this, and they had all these right answers. But I'm like, Yeah, but I'm not watching it in your daily life. Like you're not staying hydrated all day and you're not having breakfast and you're not doing this. So like if we want to jump levels, what do we need to do? And I'm like, we need to figure out a way to hold some accountability and kind of create this ongoing life of a champion, if you will. And so I made just a paper-based planner that like was just for these kids. And I was like, I got it printed at mom and pop shop over here. And next thing you know, another team was like, hey, I'd like to implement this with my team. And I'm like, well, cost me a lot of money to get it printed over here, but I'll get you another set. And so before you know it, like other teams in the state are asking for it. And so I had to figure out and pivot how to get these done. But for a lot of the teams that we're working with, it's exactly that. Not they don't do every element, they don't always do everything, but teams find specific needs. I have one team in Delaware, it's our state champion soccer team. Their biggest takeaway from our entire planner is their focus words. They have one athlete each week come present the focus word to the team, and he's like, we do everything else, but like the focus words are favorite because now all of a sudden there's communication amongst teammates that we don't normally have, and we struggle with that. Now they're communicating about things that are important to them, and now when they get on the field, they're communicating better, so it works. Um, Other leadership stuff, right? So like teams will take the planner and the captains will take the team in their little pods and talk about what's coming up this week. We have all these built-in leadership components to it. So there's all these unintended things that are happening that I didn't really expect to happen. But really it's all just based in an idea of let's monitor what we're doing habitually each day and let's try to stack our habits on top of each other so we're getting good sleep, so we're hydrated, so we're eating before our games and our practices the right way, so we're focused in practice, we're reflecting afterwards, so when coach says what did you do well, what can you do better, and how can you do it better, you know what to say. How can I be a better teammate? We're keeping track of our grades so things aren't spiraling out of control. And so at the end of the day, we're just trying to help athletes be more intentional about their lives. And, when they can do that, you have a better foundation to coach from. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. So it's been cool. It's been exciting. And we're looking forward to growing it.
What tangibles have you seen play out on the back end since you started doing this and since other programs have started implementing this, right? Because we talked and I pointed out some things, and then my resistance, not individually, but what I see from a standpoint of our student athletes are, okay, here's another task, right? Here's another homework assignment. So what have you seen on the back end in regard to wins, and what are some of the built-in resistance that you've had to overcome?
Yeah, that's great. And that is it. It's right. Like how do we keep this from being another thing for coaches? And how do we keep this from being another thing for athletes? It's just like anything else. I'm a teacher by trade, right? So I'll get my kids to do mindfulness. Imagine having 60 high school kids laying on the ground, focused on their breathing. They've never done it before. They're not doing it. I have to show them why. The idea of trust the process, that's gone, I think. You have to know why, that they have to learn the process. All right, here's why, guys. You're a free throw shooter late in the game. We need relaxation techniques. I'm not an athlete. Okay, you're in the musical. You're going to sing in front of 1,000 people. How can we control our breathing? Oh, that makes sense. You're going to go to an interview. This is all these things. And now all of a sudden there's like, okay, well, that makes sense to me. And then I tell them this. Now we got to find the people that are famous that do it. Go find 5 people who practice mindfulness. I already know the Google search optimizations. It's LeBron. It's Taylor Swift. It's all the coolest of the cool. So now all of a sudden it becomes real to them and people that they look up to do it. This is no different, right? I think scaffolding this is really important. Start with just a little habit each day. Maybe the word of the week, the gratitude, sleep time, and social media time. Do that for a week. Let that become a habit and a part of your process. And then the following week, stack something on there. They need to see a little bit of victory before you overwhelm them and bombard them with 18 different things. So I think that's number one. I think number two, it has to be consistent. Coaches have to be consistent with it, but they need to let the ownership be on the students a little bit. And it can't, when things get tough, it can't just be like, well, listen, the planner's got to go because I need time for X's and O's. If I could look back at my career and change one thing, I would have spent more time on the process oriented type things early rather than just the X and O's. And I mean by that is the mindset shifts and how do we build culture, because those things are long-term solutions and not instant fixes. And so when teams invest in it for the long term, it pays off. We had a baseball team in our state, a good friend of mine, hasn't made it past the first round of the state tournament in 15 years. 5 years I've been saying, hey, coach, let's get into culture coaching. Let's start focusing on these other things. Finally, this year, he said, all right, I'm all in. We worked with them almost on a weekly basis. They had some ups and downs. End of the year, they started playing really good ball, and they trusted the process because they knew the process all year long. They ended up making the state finals. Now, they lost in the state finals. They haven't been in the state finals in 35 years. And their team wasn't even that good, but their culture was right. They trusted the process. They trusted in one another. They had a good foundation of what they did, and it was huge. So I think teaching them why it's important, who does this stuff now, aka every athlete in the world that's elite does habit stacking. That's the reason why Atomic Habits is New York Times bestseller for like 7,000 weeks in a row. So all that stuff's super, super important, but you got to teach them because otherwise they don't know what they don't know.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on in regards to the approach, right? How are you pointing out the high achievers in the world that aren't necessarily just athletes, right?
Yeah.
And I think you will see as you read the memoirs, let's call them, or the notes on these people that sit at the top of society, regardless of what industry they're in, it's about right how disciplined they are with their time and what are they doing with that. And so I think it's a great method to try to start this early with kids. Let me ask one more follow-up and then we'll wrap up. As you lead people to this water, let's say, what are the lowest hanging, most consistent challenges that you would say face, let's say me, from implementing this, right? What gets them over the hump as you obviously try to onboard more people to your program, but also how are you helping people to enhance their program, right? That's the end of the day. That's what it's about, right? Yes, you have this thing that you implemented that's been successful and it can help you, but hey, I got X, Y, and Z, right? Elevator pitch in regards to, look, sample this thing out and tell me I'm wrong. What does that look like?
Yeah, you're gonna have to keep me on task here because I could go on and on and on. But yeah, for me, I think it's exactly what you and I did weeks ago, right? Like here, I believe in this thing so much if implemented correctly. I think for me, sending it, you come on and buy it, and you don't have a conversation with me. I don't know what the likelihood is if unless you're like this top-notch real deal, like this is what we do, this is built in, so be it. I want to have conversations with coaches about how can it and be implemented in their team and how you can learn from teams that are doing it successfully already. So to me, it's like send us a message, jump on a call with us, talk to us. Maybe it's not right for your program. I'm not going to sell to you if it's not right for your program. But I think learning implementation methods of teams who have done it well is really the big thing. And it's like you said, some coaches have to get over the hurdle. You mean to tell me I got to give up 10 minutes of my practice each week? I think you can. I think when we look at the total time that you have in practice, or maybe do a study hall one day a week and watch what happens. You know, push your Monday practice back 30 minutes and watch what happens to your grades and watch what happens to, you're not chasing around this kid to turn in missing work anymore. And, you have a chance to do some reflection with your programs and watch what happens. So I think the low bearing fruit is obviously learn how to do this. And if you need to learn how to do this, contact us because I'll jump on a call with anybody, anytime. And if I can't, one of my other colleagues will. But we want this to fit your program. And we want to tell you how that can happen based on our experiences thus far.
Love that. And we'll put the contact info in the show notes. And let's end with this. This is what I always like to ask people, and I'm curious about. What is something you've most recently changed your mind on? And in regards to coaching or not, but hey, I used to be dug in over here and now I'm over here and here's why. And people that know me now or knew me 10 years ago would laugh that I'm now saying this. And this is always just about a growth mindset piece, right? How are we continuing to evolve?
Yeah, growth mindset. I think I mentioned it too. Is like when 15 years ago, if I said this is what we're doing, I'm not the why guy. Like I was like, this is what we're doing, man. We're just doing this, right? Like you're not going to question my authority as a young whippersnapper, moron coach who didn't really know. And now I'm like, I'm going to tell you I want to tell you why we do everything. I'm like that in class. Why are we doing this? Great question. I'm going to answer that for you because they can get behind some really crazy stuff when they understand why. And I think that has been a major takeaway for me. And yeah, that's what I would say. I'd say I encourage the why. I encourage the why.
Yeah, I love that. And I think,
Oh, wait, I'm interested to hear yours. Can you tell me yours? I'm sure all your other listeners have heard. I'd love to hear yours.
mine come up all the time. And so in regards to most recently, I would say international travel is something that I am embracing and seeking out. For the history of my life, I didn't have a passport. I'm doing basketball 300 days a year and I don't have time to do it. And right before COVID, we got passports. Went to Japan with my daughter's Japanese class as a chaperone last April. My older daughter was studying abroad in Italy in the fall, so we went to see her over Thanksgiving. Went back to Japan with the family in April. I'm going to Australia in July. And so, like in the last 18 months, right, I'm getting multiple passport stamps. And as an American, we are very insular, even regionally, right? Nationally. And I think getting out there and seeing the rest of the world is very informative, humbling, fascinating. And it's one of those things where it's it's not that important to know it is. And how can
Yeah.
I now figure out my next trip and hack that? And so I think I'm constantly looking for how to convince myself otherwise, and based on the conversations around the show. But I would say that's the one that's most front of mind because I'm a month out from going on our next trip. And part of my trip is designed around sitting down and having conversations around athletics. So I'm going to 3 different places over the course of 2 weeks, and I've spent the last 3 weeks teeing up meetings as part of my travel or air quote vacation. And it's like I'm going to spend the time sitting down with coaches and programs and asking them about what they do to try to figure out ways to get better. And so I think ultimately that's one. I'd have to think a little harder on some others, but that's where I'm at. And it goes to what you said, the growth mindset piece, right? You've stepped out of coaching to chase this other passion right now. Does that mean you're done coaching? Probably not, but it's for now you are. And I think that comes from the idea of getting more efficient, getting better at communication, trying to move the needle on the margins where winning is done, so to speak.
Yep. Gosh, I love that. That's good for you, man. That's maybe I'm gonna start doing that now too.
Anyway, great coming on. I want to talk to you a little bit when we hang up, but I will definitely get all this info in the show notes so people can chase you down and hopefully onboard some of your program.
Appreciate it, Justin. Thanks for having me.